This week on the Backtable podcast.
There are so many things that we can do at an individual level that might not feel like we're making that much of a difference, especially when we see all the bummer headlines. But then remembering there are so many other people that are also doing that. It's just that each of our individual efforts don't make the headlines, but together something amazing is still brewing underneath the surface. And so that's the hope that I hold on to as we wait for more data and more information and more kind of treatment technological breakthroughs.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Backtable ENT podcast. My name is Ashley Agan. I'll be one of your hosts today, and I'm joined by the lovely Gopi Shah. Hey, Gopi. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Ash?
I'm good. I'm stoked to be doing a random Monday afternoon podcast. We've got double guests this afternoon, so it's going to be a good show.
It's going to be a great show. Let me introduce our guests. We have Dr. Jennifer Villwock, who has been on the show, a friend of the pod. She's a professor in otolaryngology at the University of Kansas Medical Center. Her clinical practice focuses on rhinology and allergy. And Jen today brought another brilliant friend, Dr. Bill Reisacher. He's a professor in otolaryngology at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Weill Cornell Medical College. His clinical practice focuses on environmental allergies and food allergies, and they are here today to talk to us about the impact of environmental extremes on the unified airway. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
So we always like to start off the show just giving you a chance to tell us about yourself and your practice. Bill, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a comprehensive ENT. I practice in a major urban area in New York City. Most of my practice focuses on airborne allergies, food allergies in children and adults. So you can imagine I have a very nose-heavy practice.
And what about you, Jen?
Yeah, I'm very similar. I'm a trained rhinologist, but most of my practice focuses on inflammatory disease. And so that's where the allergy and the asthma and today's topic in terms of how environmental extremes are impacting that are relevant. Because I get questions all the time about why do my allergies seem to be getting worse? Why are my sinuses getting worse, etc.
I get the same questions.
Yeah, me too. So let's talk about it. Just as setting the stage, how do you think about, the unified airway, the impact that the, changes in the environment are having to essentially airway symptoms, upper and lower?
Yeah, I think it's difficult for patients, because they go to different doctors and we sort of specialize in different areas of the body. Ear, nose, and throat, we're more the upper part of the airway. The pulmonary doctors, they're more the lower part of the airway. But it really is not only just a unified airway, but really a unified body. So you really have to think about, how inflammatory conditions are affecting multiple systems of the body, gastrointestinal, the skin, etc.
And what are patients asking you guys? Like when they come to clinic, how are they phrasing the questions? What are their concerns?
For me, the question is mostly why. Why do I feel this way? Why are none of the medications working? Why can't anybody figure out why I'm feeling this way? There is a real sense of desperation in the air. Jennifer, I don't know if you've picked up on that as well.
Yeah, I think what's particularly frustrating for a lot of folks too is that they're seeing an evolution of their symptoms, and so in their mind, they're like, I'm doing all the right things. I'm doing the sprays, I'm doing the rinses, I'm doing all the things that you guys have told me to do. But my allergies seem to be getting worse, or I just can't clear some of these symptoms.
A lot of people come in and they're also very heavily focused on allergies as a source of their symptom. And I always make sure at some point during my conversation with them to say there are many things out there that cause allergy symptoms besides allergies. And that's a really long list of things: chemicals, odors, pollutants, particles, all the things we're going to be talking about in the next hour.
Yeah, and I think, it's nice sometimes to have a term. I just learned about this not too long ago, but in the public health literature, a lot of folks are calling all these things that we're exposed to your exposome. Kind of like you have chromosomes, you have all sorts of other fancy words to describe the things that are impacting our health. But like you said, Bill, so many people, we focus so much on allergies, viruses, bacteria, that we forget that in the air that we're breathing, there's a whole host of other things that we're continually being exposed to.
Exactly. And unfortunately, we have great tests for allergies, which is why we focus so heavily on them. But for all those chemicals and all the pollutants that are in our air, there's no test for these.
Yeah. I feel like that comes up a lot when I have a patient who tests negative for allergies and they're thinking, well, like, what else could this be? And the natural progression is that conversation of like, well, there's all these other things that can affect how your nose is working.
Absolutely. Yeah. They say, doctor, is this all in my head? And to be honest, with our specialty, it is all in their head. But truly, it's not their imagination. So that's where you have to really do the deep dive into all the things that could be affecting them. And then you have to dig into the social history. You have to find out, what have they been doing? Have they moved different apartments? What part of town are they living? What's their job like? Are they working in a basement? All sorts of problems. Have they cleaned out the vents at work recently?
Yeah, that list can get really long. Like, do you have like a questionnaire that you use to try to hit those things? Or do you just kind of use open-ended questions and kind of collect it that way?
Yeah, I have to say, the questions are so broad and they have to be so tailored to the situation. I have some very basic questions, but really it's more digging into the history, and it's just the conversation, just the evolution of the conversation. What's changed in your life? Tell me about your new house, your new apartment. Tell me about your work. It's really just having a conversation. Unfortunately, we're all pressed for time, trying to see more patients in less time, but this is the time when you really have to take that extra moment and have a conversation with the patient.
This might be a silly question, but when we're using the term environmental extremes, is that just to quote storms, hurricanes, flooding, or is, moving or changing the job, occupational exposure, can that also be considered an environmental extreme? Like, how do you kind of think of it in your practice?
Yeah, of course. You don't have to move anywhere. You don't have to change anything to be exposed to a lot of chemicals and problems. And of course, that's related to all the extremes we've been having with our weather, tied into many things.
Yeah. And I think they all go hand in hand, and I think, to Bill's point, this is why it's so important to let people tell their stories and to ask those open-ended questions, because oftentimes what you might have on a checklist, again, because the list of potential exposures is so broad, you could not possibly get through that whole checklist with a patient. But in letting them describe, okay, what's new in your life or what has changed with the worsening of your symptoms can be really helpful, because I think that these exposures can be linked to just their daily life, but they can also be linked to the increases in, heat, weather extremes, storms, etc. Like if you think about someone who has been working in a basement and it's been fine until that flood, or until that bad rainstorm event or what have you. Sometimes it really takes almost letting the patient do their own due diligence and detective work to kind of bring to the forefront what we think might be happening. And we don't always have a strategy for mitigating that, right? If your airway is highly reactive and you live next to an area that's on fire, like you either got to go or there's not necessarily a great nasal spray for that. But I think for a lot of folks too, what they are seeking is an answer, even if there's not necessarily an easy solution, because sometimes having these difficult health things that we deal with, as long as there's an explanation and an understanding there, it can make those diagnoses and those symptoms a little bit easier to bear.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jen. And I think looking for the patterns is really key to trying to figure out what is the changing factor. Many times, if it's related to air quality issues, these are symptoms that occur throughout the year. You ask them when it's worse, when it's better. They say no time. It's bad all the time. Maybe it's gotten worse as the years have gone on, but there's really no seasonality to it. It's just a general continual worsening of symptoms.
And when that's the case and you've got, no real pattern, but it's just symptoms all the time, and, let's say negative allergy testing, and we're using all this, we're using sprays and rinsing our nose and doing all the things. Like, do you ever just, kind of have to blame it on the environment in general without having like a specific culprit to point to?
Yeah, I think you have to try to do as much as you can, medication-wise, try to optimize their indoor environment. There are many things that can be done outside of medications, things like air purifiers to try to keep their indoor air quality as high as possible. Yeah, I think it does help people to know that it's not just their imagination, it's not just some invisible enemy. There are things out there, and a lot of people are suffering. Just knowing that other people are suffering like they are is helpful to people. If you look at the whole world's population, this is amazing. I can't believe this number. They estimate that 90% of the world's population lives in areas that are considered poor air quality by the World Health Organization standard. 90% of the world's population. If you look at the US, it's 40%. So, I mean, imagine that. And of course, the people who are most at risk are the people who are coming into our office, the people with respiratory illnesses, people with the extremes of age, the very young, very old, people who have other illnesses, sinusitis and other conditions. They're the ones who are really getting hit the hardest.
Well, should we kind of break it down into variables a little bit in terms of temperature variability? What do you find in your practice? Do people say, like, every once in a while, I'll have patients that come in that will say, my kids, it's always when the temperature gets from hot to cold. That's when they catch the cold. We have a runny nose, congestion, and they can't clear it for several weeks. And then all of a sudden, when they're getting better, the temperature changes again. How does temperature play a role that you've noticed in your practice?
Yeah, I think what you said is really key, is the change in temperature. Our noses are amazing organs. They're thermometers, they're barometers, they're hygrometers. They can sense all of these changes in the environment. And when it's going back and forth, the nose reacts in its own defense, just like if it was around a harmful chemical or an allergen that it was sensitive to. So we have to take that into account. That's one of the patterns. When the weather is rapidly changing, I see some people come in just for that reason.
And I think it's important to note, too, if we're talking about folks who are noticing year upon year that in different seasons their allergies are worse, temperature can play a role there, too, as can the rising amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere, just in terms of it drives plants, especially plants like ragweed, which is a major fall allergen, to grow more robustly and to release a lot more of that allergy goodness. So that's another way, beyond some of the more within season variability that we see with temperatures and barometric changes. But over time, the plants that we are allergic and sensitized to are actually making more of the antigens that we are allergic and sensitized to.
Yeah. All those greenhouse gases, particularly CO2, it's like the insulating blanket for the earth, right? But when that builds up, the temperature starts to climb, and that extends also the pollinating season. Even, up here in the Northeast, we're seeing much later frost and much earlier thaws. So we're seeing a very contracted winter season, and that means more pollen in the air most of the year.
So longer seasons and more pollen, both
Exactly.
are
It's
happening.
a double whammy. And then, of course, all the irritants in the air can make your body even more allergic and can allow the allergens to be more potent and to get further inside your body. So I think we're up to quadruple whammy, right? You get hit from every end.
And, we usually, think of saline and Flonase or nasal antihistamines, nasal steroid sprays. How do you counsel or manage patients when they are having these kinds of complaints? Is it different than what it was 10, 15 years ago when maybe we weren't having as much extremes? Or have we always, and we're just now kind of seeing its impact in our clinical practice or talking about it more?
The problems with climate change and the rising temperatures, that's been going on since, the Industrial Revolution. We've had our temperature on our planet has actually risen one degree centigrade since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And you would say that sounds like nothing. 1 degree, what's 1 degree centigrade? But, they say if you go to 1.5 degrees centigrade, then there's like irreversible damage to the planet. So, we're kind of getting close there. So temperatures are definitely rising. And yeah, what I see is a lot of patients are using so much medication, because now it's over the counter. So I find myself more and more actually counseling them on how to de-escalate their medications. They've been on antihistamines maybe for a year or two, and there are problems associated with that. So a lot of my practice is trying to bring people to an appropriate usage of medication so they have a better effect. With allergy medication, more is not always better.
I think there's been conversation, I think, in the public health realm and the epidemiology realm about the importance of climate change, as Bill mentioned, for a number of years. But I think the public awareness is catching up. And I think a lot of that is reflected in the headlines that we see, right, about wildfires. Like apparently New Jersey is having a giant wildfire, which that is not a geographic region I would have predicted for that sort of exposure, but I think this is something that everyone is going to be talking more about, especially when we see this rise in allergies and other inflammatory airway diseases like asthma. And what do we do to mitigate the risks?
Yeah, we had a wildfire in Brooklyn and Manhattan. Usually the only things that are on fire are the dumpsters and the garbage cans, but we're used to seeing things burn here, but not our brush, and trees.
So moving on to other environmental factors. So what about barometric pressure changes?
Yeah, that has a big impact. I have many patients who are extremely sensitive to that, and they're very upset that they can tell they get headaches and nasal conditions every time the weather is changing. But that probably had a benefit through our early human ancestry, right? Because if you were able to do that, you were the ancient weather person, right?
The storm's coming
Everybody would
in.
look to you. And if you were the person, if you started rubbing your nose, people would take off for the hills because they knew that a storm was coming. So that is extremely beneficial. So I reframe it for my patients. I tell them it's their superpower. And they kind of warm up to it a little bit more. They understand at least, okay, well, this had a benefit for us somewhere in our human history. But yeah, it's a huge challenge because, that's the rule. We're seeing so much fluctuation in the temperature that they have to use more and more medication, and they don't want to go out and participate in activities. They want to stay indoors, and we're already spending close to 90% of our lives in the indoor arena.
Yeah, I feel like I have patients who ask me about that as a recommendation for avoiding, symptoms. And it kind of makes me cringe a little bit, the thought of like recommending people to stay inside, because I'm just I feel like there's so many benefits to being in nature. But for some patients who are really sensitive, that discussion comes up. Or people will ask me about moving, like, should I move? Which is, an interesting conversation too.
It can work out well for you for a while. So you'll feel good for a while, but then you're going to get sensitive to all the different pattern of things there. So yeah, I tell people,
move every 2 to 4 years.
Become a nomad.
I can't stand moving, so I'm not doing that. I'm not doing it. I'll invest in Kleenex. I'll do what I have to do. But moving around, not an option. But yeah, it's severely limiting. And, we see a lot of people in the city, you go into stores, the department stores, you walk past the perfume counter, people who are very chemical sensitive as well. That's all wrapped up into this whole extra superpower nose sensitivity, right? They can't even go into stores, and they literally can't shop for their clothing. They have to do it all online, which, many people are doing anyway.
So I think for these folks that are having some of the sinusitis type symptoms or just allergy symptoms that are arising with barometric changes, one thing to be aware of for them as well is don't forget about migraines. A lot of the causes of sinusitis and some of these allergy symptoms, especially when it's the facial pain and pressure, they have a lot of overlap with migraine. And so that's a conversation that I have with all of my patients who are presenting with these sorts of symptoms in response to pressure changes. Because like Bill and you guys were joking about, yeah, you could offer them, maybe they live in a caravan, right, that just follows the low pressure fronts, or something so that they never have to experience those pressure changes. But there's not a good way, to escape those sorts of weather patterns, generally speaking. And so if there is something else going on where there is a little bit of stronger data to support migraine triggers associated with barometric changes, then that can potentially be a huge win for patients in terms of symptoms, if you can get them on an appropriate either migraine prophylactic or abortive therapy and get them some relief. And then I would say the other thing that I think people have a little bit more use for and that's becoming more popular as well is some of the pollen trackers, because that gives people actual actionable information, and a lot of those will also give information about the air quality overall as well. So if they're a person where they've got the double whammy of allergies and asthma, pollen counts are high, air quality is terrible, that might truly be I hate to say it, but let's stay indoors kind of day, as opposed to if everything else is looking okay and maybe it's just a pressure system coming through. Obviously they know their body best and they should respect what their body's telling them, but that might lead to a different recommendation.
Sure. That's a good point, Jen. And even making sure to keep the allergens like pollen outside. You can't prevent them from being outside, but you want to try to prevent them from becoming indoor allergens. So separating indoor and outdoor clothing can be very helpful. Making sure windows are closed early morning when pollen is highest, 5 to 10 a.m. So closing them before you go to bed. These can all help create that safe haven in your bedroom, which is hopefully allergen and toxin free.
Yeah. And you had mentioned earlier, like having air filters to try to purify the air purifiers. I feel like patients will ask if there's particular types or, a type of filter that you have to be on the lookout for so that they know that they're not getting something that's just kind of like, gimmicky? Like, are they really, cleaning the air kind of thing?
And a lot of the devices now, the HEPA filtration devices, and also the electronic precipitators, those, they do have a lot of bells and whistles. So I tell people, buyer beware. They do have the bells and whistles, but you want it to have the basic technology, and you want to make sure that it's appropriate for the size room you're trying to purify. A lot of people have a really tiny purifier in a huge room, or vice versa. And, so it's really just about shopping for those products. But I like to recommend the HEPA filtration devices are good. They're pretty low maintenance. Every now and then you have to change the pre-filter, but they're basically low maintenance. Another good point that you brought up, Jen, was that a lot of other systems are affected besides the respiratory tract. We get focused in our specialty on the respiratory tract, but with all of the allergies and also the environmental and climate problems, many systems in the body are affected. In fact, all systems of the body are affected: the cardiovascular system, neurodegenerative disease, even mood disorders. And you really have to take that all into account. It becomes almost like a spider web problem after a while.
And so moving on to like pollution and particulate matter. And I feel like PM 2.5, like small particles are like being discussed more, which that one, it's hard for me to kind of understand what the action item is for that, because it sounds like the particles are too small to really filter. So maybe just not staying inside or getting away. But can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, it's difficult because the small particles can act as sort of enhancers to enhance the immunogenicity and the allergenicity of other products. Not to mention, alone, they can also create more permeability in our mucosal membranes and the lining of our airway. So all of these allergens that were coming through our airway, now they're getting deeper access to it. So these particles can affect us in so many different ways. These small particulate chemicals that are in the air, the volatile chemicals that are floating in the air.
Is that something a sinus rinse or irrigation can wash off the membrane? Or once we're exposed to it, I'm just going to have more permeability and more immunogenicity or genicity to the, what's the word?
That's easy for you to say. That's easy. Yes, no, saline is great. I mean, as I learned, and you probably did too, in our surgical training, the solution to pollution is dilution.
Wash it out, right?
Just wash it out. Just keep going. Yeah. Saline, use it liberally. I educate people how to do irrigations, how to do saline mist, keep it with them, and just use that as off as possible. That's a freebie. That's all benefit and very, very little risk. Another, interesting topic. Yeah, we're talking about small particles and what small particles can do for you, and it can also affect our genome as well. And that's a topic maybe we'll get into a little bit later in the discussion. We have our genome, and then what we call the epigenome, which is kind of the area around our genome that controls our genome and how genes are transcribed and expressed. And all these small particles can have a big impact on the way genes are expressed. So that can lead to more inflammatory conditions, to more breakdown in our membranes. So basically, our defenses are being lowered on the regular.
But I think, to what you were alluding to, Ashley and Gopi, about, well, what else do we do, right? Because it's like, all right, so saline till the cows come home, which is not the most compelling solution sometimes to folks, right? Because they would like some sort of endpoint or something where you can see some sort of benefit. And there are things that can be done, but they're outside of like what we think of, I think, in terms of the usual medical context, right? So what are those things? Well, those are things like, thinking about city design. How are we designing urban and suburban areas, right? To where they're going to have adequate green spaces and they're going to have plants that are going to suck up some of that CO2 and release oxygen and release more humidification into the air as well. And you could say, well, maybe that's not going to be so helpful on like a my backyard or my balcony level. But if this sort of intentional design is going into city planning and urban planning, it can significantly decrease the heat sinks or the tendency for all of these concretified areas to just absorb and release heat, right? Which then plays into all the other things that we talked about. It can decrease the amount of contaminants that are in the air. If the soil is covered, the wind's not going to come and blow it away so that we can inhale it. So there are things that can be done, but it's at that advocacy, higher planning level. And so I think that's important for us as physicians who should also be advocates to know, and also for our patients if they want to take some sort of action. It sounds really silly, but currently it's April, so it's Earth Month, right? So it's like, well, let's try to do some Earth smart things while we're at it, not just for the benefit of the environment, but also for our own health.
And on the topic of urban planning, even just planting the types of trees, the city tends to plant male trees. Yes, certain trees are male and certain trees are female for some trees. So if you plant mostly male trees, which they grow fast, they have a very deep canopy, which is really nice. They don't drop fruit, so they don't mess up the city streets. So cities like to plant male trees. But of course, those are the trees that release most of the pollen. So over time, that's going to just cause more and more problems with pollen levels.
That's so interesting. I just read that recently about male and female trees. So, but my thought was like, so if I'm going to the nursery to buy some plants, like how do I know if I'm buying a male plant or a female plant?
That's tree specific sometimes.
Yeah, you might need it. Well,
just look at the bottom of it. Like
the next guest will be an arborist.
Okay. No, that was a pregnant pause before the answer to that. Well, no, you can't tell because female trees bear fruit. So if it's a young tree, you're not going to be able to tell, right? So you have to wait to see when it grows up. Somehow they can tell. I think arborists can tell.
Right. We'll have that as our next guest, or potentially.
That's a topic for a different day. That's way above my pay grade.
How did we not include an arborist at the table today? That's like, where was our blind spot on that one?
But there are clear signs, with what's coming off of their branches. There are clear signs, but that is above my pay grade. But they can tell. They know. And then certain trees, like elm trees, they have both male and female. So it doesn't really matter with some trees, but with the Dutch elm disease, which swept through the U.S., in the 1940s or so, wiped out so many elm trees, right? There's always an elm street in every city, right? There was a reason for that because they had so many elm trees. When they died off, they just put a lot of maple trees in there because they wanted to reforest as fast as possible. So now we're seeing the consequences 30, 40 years later. We're seeing the young maple trees are reaching maturity and just cranking out the pollen.
And for people who are living, we talked about in an urban setting, there might be more pollution and particles related to chemicals in the air. Does that mean, what about people who live in rural areas, who are out in the country? Are there other things that we're not thinking about as far as like their exposure to pollution and PM 2.5?
Yeah, it's definitely still a consideration. And there can be some unique exposures. Like there's particular fungi that can be very allergenic that typically appears in very specific situations, like on corn, for example. So I have some patients who know, like, yeah, when it's corn harvesting season, something bad's about to happen to my sinuses and my allergies. Or, just thinking about the particulate matter, depending on the practices by which people farm. If it's been a dry spell and people are tilling, there's going to be a ton of particulate matter that's in the air, and I think everybody has seen pictures of, the Dust Bowl, et cetera. Those sorts of things are still happening in terms of us losing topsoil. And so where does that go? Into the air for us to breathe, So I think it's important to not think like, oh, countryside, pristine, no problems, let's bark up another tree, in terms of what might be going on with that person.
Right. And we're seeing with the severe storms that particles are being taken miles and miles further on the wind because it's just traveling immense distances. And of course, when you have rising temperatures out in the rural areas, all the extra CO2 is going into those plants. But guess what? Then they're growing and producing more pollen. So you end up having higher pollen levels for that reason. So, the levels of CO2, the rise in CO2 and the amount of ragweed pollen just literally goes lockstep. If you look at the graph, it just goes hand in hand.
It's super interesting.
Yeah, which brings up then the next step there too. Like, oh, well, if you're a farmer and there's all these undesirable plants growing because the greenhouse effect has created a greenhouse for them and plants typically like to grow there, then that introduces other exposures, right? Because if this is your livelihood, you have to find a way to manage the undesirable plants. And a lot of people will use different chemicals for that as well, which now is yet another component that you're introducing into everything else that this person and these communities are exposed to.
Yeah, it's so true.
Bill, you had mentioned that these small particulate matter can affect how genes are expressed in terms of the effects on the genome and epigenome. Can you go into that a little bit more? Like what are we finding, and in terms of clinical application, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, we're finding that, many of these chemicals are getting in, even tobacco smoke. The list is almost endless of these volatile chemicals that can affect the epigenome, which is, again, that area sort of that affects the actual genes. For many inflammatory conditions, we're seeing this as more relevant. For many years, we looked at asthma and in our field, nasal polyps. And the thought was that all the inflammation from all of these things getting in eventually at the end leads to a breakdown in the lining of the nose or the lining of the lungs. But now the epigenetic studies that have been done have actually sort of turned that on its head, showing that really the first problem was the breakdown in the barrier. So these chemicals are getting in and they're allowing the membranes to become more porous. And that is opening the floodgates for all the inflammation rather than the other way around. So that's been a real change. And that's why all the epigenome studies are really fascinating, because maybe we can somehow find a way to correct many of these problems, which we haven't had solutions for years.
Yeah, I think as we're discussing all of these, potential culprits, that we're constantly being exposed to, I think the thing that keeps coming up is kind of like, what's the best thing we can do as ENT doctors, and what's the best thing our patients can be doing to kind of help with the situation. And I think it can be kind of overwhelming because it's not just one thing, right? It's kind of like this constellation of all sorts of possible villains, so it's kind of hard to get behind, like, okay, it's that one, we just got to fight against, pollution or what one thing, but it's like all these things. So it's like, okay, what do and I think when you start talking to patients about the lists of things that they could be doing, I think that can be kind of overwhelming too.
No, it's definitely overwhelming, but I found at least giving them just a little bit more understanding of what's going on and an understanding of the complexity, that it's not just allergies that nobody's found yet. Understanding the complexity gives people some relief, even if you haven't maybe made their nasal congestion any better. Of course, you keep trying and you try everything you can. We all do. But sometimes just at the end of the day, having them understand the problem a bit better can be helpful in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. And I think that list of options can be helpful, right? Not with the understanding that every patient is going to try everything, but anytime that I'm recommending anything to a patient, I always couch it in what's going to work best for you is the thing that you can do, right? So if any of these is like, nope, too expensive, or nope, not going to work with my life, then we take those off the table and then we regroup and kind of see what's left. And I think having those sorts of conversations so that your patients can feel like they're active participants in their own health is very important, especially because, as we know, we're going to keep trying our best, but all of these symptoms aren't going to go away. And I think intuitively, patients understand how complex all of these interrelationships are, right? How like we used to just think, oh, it's sinuses and then a magical barrier, and then there's the lungs, right? And then a magical barrier. I mean, patients know that that's not how their bodies work, but we have just operated in kind of this very reductionist mindset for a while in medicine. So I think taking this bigger picture is somewhat intuitive for patients, and hopefully will be for us as well.
That's exactly right, Jen. And another thing that I found, the more things that I give patients to do, the less likely it is that they'll do any of them.
Yeah,
So
100%.
I try after a long conversation, I try to pick maybe one or two things to try.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a victory. If they can try that, okay, that didn't work, let's try something else. We'll keep going. We'll try different things, but give patients doable bites.
Yeah, I like that. Almost like, here's a menu of all the things we could do. Don't do them all. Let's pick one or two and let's work on that. Yeah. Let's not do all of it.
It's like when you get a wine list, the wine list, which is about this thick, right? You go through the book and you just say, I'll just have a beer, forget it. I'm just not going to order wine, right? If you have too many options, you're not going to do anything.
That's true. Like decision fatigue. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how some of the environmental changes might affect indoor air quality? Like you'd mentioned, having a set of clothes when you go outside, or leaving your shoes. I imagine leaving my shoes, jacket, and my bag maybe in the front of, at the door or something, so I don't bring some of that in the house. But what have we seen in terms of indoor air quality due to some of the external environmental changes?
Yeah, well, I can tell you I have one specific incident. Well, people are spending a lot more time indoors, but also our homes are becoming extremely energy efficient. And I had a patient who started suffering with, sinus headaches, et cetera, and allergies. The workup was negative for allergies. But then the whole family started developing problems. And lo and behold, we found they moved into a new construction which didn't have an adequate air handler. And they were actually building up carbon dioxide levels that were toxic in the indoor environment because their air handler wasn't able to outgas enough of the chemicals. And people who are very concerned with cleanliness, particularly during the pandemic, people who kind of went a little free with the Lysol, that all those chemicals build up and they don't all necessarily get out of the indoor environment. They start building up.
How would one know about the, buildup of CO2? Like, how did that family discover that that's what was happening?
Well, eventually, once all their family members started coming down with the same problem, we said, okay, this is a problem in your house. A process of deduction, and then they can measure air quality. You can measure chemicals in the air, and they found dangerously high levels of carbon dioxide. And once they put in an adequate air handler into their house, problem was solved.
Yeah. And I think we also have to think about the impact of all these environmental extremes on our homes. And I mentioned it earlier, but with all of these extreme weather events, we're having much heavier downpours, more extreme storms, and that in many parts of the country, while part of the country's on fire, the other half is underwater. And yes, the waters recede, et cetera. People rebuild. Most people choose to stay in their home communities, right? Because that's where their sense of home and their sense of place is. But that means that there's going to be exposures to things like mold, right, that thrive in those areas that perhaps levels, or types that previously were not there. So that's something to consider as well. And as we've had more and more of these events, there are folks that actually study mold exposures, allergies, asthma, and airway issues after events like Hurricane Katrina, et cetera, because now there's been adequate amount of time since those initial incidences. And yeah, they have seen that, yes, there is a rise in fungus and spores in these environments. And that does coincide with the things that you would imagine: emergency room visits for asthma, worsened sinusitis, worsened asthma outcomes, et cetera. So I think those things need to be on our radar as well.
Yeah, of course, I've seen more roof leak than ever.
And speaking of mold, I feel like, sometimes patients will talk about having sensitivity to mold, but they may not have a true mold allergy, but it's, through a different mechanism. And I've read some articles about hypothesis of it being related to spores or toxins from the mold itself. Can you speak to that at all? Is there a different way?
Some molds like the black mold Stachybotrys, which is oftentimes unearthed during construction and things like that. That actually is not typically related to an allergy to the mold. It produces what I call mycotoxin, which is a small chemical that you can react to. So you don't even have to be allergic to molds to have problems when you're around mold spores. If you raise the level of mold spores high enough, almost anybody is going to react. Itchy eyes, itchy nose, and throat irritation. You'll bring that out in just about anybody. But of course, if a person is sensitive or if they're allergic, clinically allergic, then they're going to develop symptoms at a much, much lower threshold.
You just need to get rid of the mold. And that's kind of the main, that'll fix
done.
things.
Yes,
particularly it's not just like wiping the entire,
particularly in a New York.
Walls.
So in a New York City apartment, you call the landlord and say, "Oh, I think I have a mold problem." You know what? They come with a can of paint. They come with a can of paint and they just paint over the dark area.
Wow,
Problem solved.
It's a problem solved. Yeah, out of sight, out of mind. Yeah, it's because it's a really expensive process, to find. You have to really find the source of the problem. You have to remediate it properly, take out any of the, the drywall or even the studs that might have gotten soaked with mold. And you have to do the process right. And unfortunately, when you're looking at rental units, sometimes, people don't want to do that. So it's a huge problem, particularly in lower income areas.
Well, I was going to ask you, both of you, all of you actually, have you ever been asked, I've been asked by like a family member, can you write a letter to our landlord that our child is, having more congestion or sinus issues because of mold? And they'll show me a picture of mold on their, bathroom door or whatever it is. How do you handle questions like that? And it kind of maybe goes to some of the advocacy, Jen, that you had mentioned. I know there's lots of different layers of advocacy, but in clinical practice, it's very much one-on-one. So I guess that question about one-on-one, and then maybe building out.
I write letters like that just about every week. A woman gave me a picture. She showed me a picture of her dining room, and I said, "That is a lovely chandelier you have." She goes, "That's not a chandelier. That was actually mold. It was a mushroom growing out of her ceiling." And I said, "Well, we really don't need too much more evidence than that. That's a mushroom." I thought it was just a really nice chandelier. But yeah, I'm writing letters almost every week saying that, yes, I think that, mold and their environmental conditions are contributing significantly to their respiratory problems. Absolutely.
And that to their landlord or whoever might request that, or, the patient might.
To the landlord, oftentimes to the lawyers.
Yeah. Okay. No, because I've had those same questions, and I don't always know how to handle it. But I think that you're right. We're their physician, and if that's what we're seeing and we think this is a contributor,
right.
What is my fear or trepidation? What am I worried about? You know what I mean?
Yes. And of course, there's so many other factors involved that it's a lawyer's paradise. You could say, well, couldn't it be that? Well, sure, it could be that too. But, we have to provide our clinical opinion saying that it's a major contributor. It may not be the only thing, but certainly it's a factor.
And Jen, can you talk to us a little bit more about advocacy? I mean, you'd mentioned larger things like being part of urban planning. Can you kind of go through sort of how you think about it, whether it's one-on-one to some of these, larger areas of whether it's, whether one of us would maybe want to participate or how we can participate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think especially in today's political climate, it's a little bit tricky, right, to figure out where are your advocacy efforts best. So I think for most of us as clinicians, it starts with educating our patients. And I think a lot of us are very comfortable with that because we're used to it. So as long as we have the information, we can help patients advocate for themselves. As Bill said, yeah, I'm always very supportive of my patients who are wanting, documentation of how some of these things can impact their health. And I'm very careful to try to put as much information as I can in my notes. Some of that has helped when we use, listening software and other things that helps us to concisely summarize what was said during the encounter that we can put in our note, which is just another layer of information and expertise that the patient can then take with them as they go to whoever that next person is. And then I think it's really about, understanding, well, where is it do you feel that your highest level of impact may be? And I know that I've gone all off into the nerdy deep end on prior podcasts here. Everybody knows that literature searches are my love language, etc. So, this is where you can educate yourself more and decide, well, maybe this is the sort of research that I would like to advocate for that should be continuing at a federal and a state level. Right? Yes, we know that PM 2.5, which is the itty bitty particles, they get right through our nose and go right into our lungs. But for us as otolaryngologists, there's larger particles that are less well studied than PM 2.5, but we have similar epidemiologic data. Maybe we should be advocating for those studies or undertaking them ourselves, or for those who are in academic medical centers, finding your friendly neighborhood pulmonologist who is studying these things and say, hey, maybe I want to learn about this too. Then I think there's the other types of political advocacy that you could engage in if you so desire. Maybe you're like, you know what? Yeah, it doesn't sound like recreating the Dust Bowl is a great idea. Maybe we should be encouraging our state and local representatives to support different agricultural practices that are thought to be healthier for the planet, et cetera. So I think that there's a lot of different ways to go about it. And it's really about aligning what your passion is with what of many of the other paths forward that you can take. And as a last pitch for most of us who are participating in / listening to these podcasts, a lot of us come from backgrounds or current statuses that are relatively privileged compared to the rest of the country. And I think this is another opportunity as well to say, hey, our money talks. Right? So you can spend your money in more eco-conscious ways or donate to the organizations that are actively getting defunded, that are trying to do this work and trying to generate this information for us so that we can be better care providers and better advocates for our patients.
Yeah, and I think what we're doing right here is fantastic. Just raising public awareness is so key as well, because a lot of people don't even realize what the issue is. They've heard all the words and all the phrases on TV and in the media, but they don't really understand Even, what's the greenhouse effect? What is that? What are these chemicals that we're talking about?
We talk about it as if it's just educating our patients, but I think it's ourselves and each other. I mean, I don't recall as much, at least 10 years ago, in terms of thinking about environmental impact on manifestations in ENT and, just being able to kind of think about that and bring that into our curriculum, I think is important.
You ask most people, can you name 2 greenhouse gases? They're gonna look at you like you have 3 heads, right? I mean, I don't know. It's a gas. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think, every time I either am part of a conversation like this or listening to something about this, I feel like the recurring theme, it tends to be, when we're talking about advocacy, things that are good for the earth tend to be kind of good for us too, like kind of like things that make the earth better as a whole. Like it trickles down to like the organism level and like tends to be better for like human health. And so it's just kind of like, this recurring theme that comes up all the time when this topic comes up.
It's hard to put that Industrial Revolution genie back in the bottle though, right? Once it's out, it's out. Those gases came out along with it. It's really hard.
As we round it out, is there anything that we forgot to mention or anything that's just really important that you want to make sure our listeners hear before we wrap up?
I think it's just so important to talk to your doctor. Some people feel embarrassed about symptoms. They don't think they're serious enough that the doctor is really going to care about them. But I think it's just really important to be honest. And if something's bothering you, talk to the doctor. We've heard it all. We're sympathetic. We're knowledgeable. We can at least try to help, even if we can't actually help. So don't be embarrassed to bring up whatever's bothering you with your doctor.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, there's still a lot that we don't know. Especially in terms of all these really sophisticated interactions, et cetera. So I know that for a lot of folks, when you think about environmental extremes and climate change, it's kind of like I'd like to turn this podcast off because it's just going to be an hour of bummers, right? and I think that, it's important to remember that it's not just bummers. There are some breakthroughs that I hold hope for in the horizon in terms of how to mitigate some of these things, better targeted treatments that target specific types of inflammation, et cetera. And then also there is a large segment of the population, I think, that cares about these things and wants to take action and finding the ways that you can to be supportive of the changes that you would like to see going forward, whether it's as simple as going to the farmer's market and supporting someone who's doing some no-till stuff so that there's less dirt coming up when everybody else is tilling. I mean, that's a simple thing, but it's something that's doable for us, right? Same for planting more trees. There are so many things that we can do at an individual level that might not feel like we're making that much of a difference, especially when we see all the bummer headlines. But then remembering there are so many other people that are also doing that. It's just that each of our individual efforts don't make the headlines, but together something amazing is still brewing underneath the surface. And so that's the hope that I hold on to as we wait for more data and more information and more kind of treatment technological breakthroughs.
Yeah. It's a beautiful place to end it.
And the earth is still a beautiful place to live.
I love it. Thank you both for coming. This was awesome.
I learned a ton. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend. If you have any questions or comments, direct message us at _Backtable ENT on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Backtable ENT is hosted by Gopi Shah
and Ashley Agan.
Our audio team is led by Kieran Gannon, with support from
Aaron Bowles,
Gabe DeGrazio,
and Josh Spencer.
Design and digital marketing led by Brian Schmitz, with support from
Taylor Spurgeon Hess.
Social media and PR by Chi Ding.
Administrative support provided by Judy Dela Cruz.
Thanks again for listening and see you next week.